Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. I'm going to talk about an ethical question that came up during this last week. I'll start by recounting a couple of stories. The first one is about King Sivi. This was a figure that seems to have been pretty widely known and beloved in ancient India because there are multiple stories about him in different traditions. He even shows up in the Mahabharata. And there's a story about him in the Pali Jatakas. But this particular story is from one of the later Sanskrit collections of Jatakas. King Sivi's particular renown was his kindness and his generosity. He was sort of a symbol of compassion. In this particular story, he's sitting in his room on his throne, and a dove flies in the window and lands on his arm. And the dove speaks. And the dove says to him, save me, there's a hawk chasing me. So the king says, yes, I will protect you, I will save your life. And the hawk comes in the window shortly after. And the king says, you may not have this dove. She's under my protection. And the hawk says, it's fine for you to exercise your generosity like that, but what am I to do? I have my children to feed. And if I don't get something to eat, don't bring them back something to eat, they're all going to die. So King Sivi offers different kinds of food to the hawk, but the hawk says, I can only eat fresh meat. So in the end, the king takes a knife and he cuts flesh out of his own thigh to feed to the hawk. And in one version of the story, it has a happy ending. The hawk turns into a god, Saka, and says, oh, it's just testing you, and miraculously heals his leg. Okay. The other story is a Tibetan one, and it concerns, I believe it's Tilopa. It's one of the lineage forebears of Milarepa in India. And Tilopa was practicing for many years, wanting to visualize Avalokiteshvara, and he could never get the hang of it. And Avalokiteshvara is the Bodhisattva of compassion. Very important figure in Tibetan Buddhism and in some strains of Mahayana Buddhism. And he was becoming disheartened with his practice. It seemed to be going nowhere. He was walking down the road one day, and he saw a wounded dog beside the road. And it had an ugly wound in its leg, and it was whimpering. So he went to see if he could help the dog, and the wound was crawling with maggots. So he started to pick the maggots out of the wound. But then, after the first few, he realized that by pulling them out, he was killing the maggots. So he had to take them out somehow more gently. So the only thing he could do was he leaned down over the wound of this dog with its oozing with pus and smelling really bad and full of maggots, and he started to try and take the maggots out with his tongue. And as soon as his tip of his tongue touched the dog turned into Avalokiteshvara and blessed him for his his, compassion. Now, you can keep those stories kind of in the background. The question that came up was, is it right to interfere if you see an animal, a predator, taking down another animal, like a snake with a frog or something like that? And these stories illustrate that it's much more complicated than you would think at first blush. There's really no good reason to favor one of these animals over the other. It seems to be a kind of purely emotional response if you think that you're doing a good deed by saving the frog from the snake, because by doing so you're depriving the snake of its dinner. And for the snake, the act of killing the frog is not a vicious, immoral act. It's simply its nature. It's one of the reasons why it's considered a realm of suffering, is because pretty well everything that comes into birth in an animal birth ends up getting eaten, except the very top predators. So there's this interaction between two beings in the animal birth playing out their ordinary animal nature. I've seen this question come up before. I remember discussing this once with a bhikkhuni, and I asked her. She was obviously like favoring the prey animal, and I asked her why. Why do you have more sympathy for the prey than for the predator? And her answer was, "Oh, there's an impulse to save the little ones." So this is like a purely emotional basis. And I don't think that that response is that emotional response doesn't have any particular wisdom behind it, and I think it's a misguided kind of compassion. You have to understand the compassion in Buddhism is karuna, and we get misled by the English word compassion, which has a slightly different connotation. The word compassion in English comes from the Latin root meaning to suffer with. So you have a feeling when you see some being in suffering that we say empathize with it. You feel some inner suffering yourself. That's considered compassion. But that's considered a misapplication of the principle in Buddhism. It's missing the mark. Compassion in Buddhism, karuna, should not make you feel suffering. And that's actually an important diagnostic, a touchstone. If your compassion is genuine, if it's the spiritually liberating karuna, what that means is an earnest wish that beings don't suffer. But it's not taking on vicariously the suffering of others. If you think about it, the whole purpose of the Buddhist path is to diminish and finally altogether escape from suffering. So something that adds to suffering cannot be skillful. So there's already a being in suffering, and then if you take on suffering yourself because of that, you're adding to the total sum of suffering in the world, and it's not helpful, and it's not spiritually liberating. But there should be an earnest wish that beings do not suffer. So when you see the frog being eaten by the snake, the skillful state of mind would be to have karuna or compassion for the frog, but at the same time to have mudita for the snake, sympathetic joy. The earnest wish, may all beings continue to enjoy the good fortune they have attained. And from the snake's point of view, it's good fortune he's found a frog to eat. So in samsara, there's constant ups and downs and constant change of form. Some beings experience a life as a frog and some as a snake. And it's not really wise for us, standing outside that exchange, to judge it or to interfere with it. It doesn't help. No. If by helping one you're going to be hurting the other. So I think that a general rule that has to be considered in questions of compassionate action is that it has to be balanced with wisdom. Wisdom and compassion are the two supreme qualities of a Buddha, and in a Buddha they're perfect. But short of Buddhahood, they often seem to be in conflict. Actions of a compassionate nature have to be guided by wisdom to make sure that you're actually diminishing suffering. It's not a response of wisdom to act from a purely emotional place. No, first of all, you need to determine if there is any useful action you can do in a situation. Many times there's not. You see suffering, you feel karuna, may this suffering be relieved, but there may not be any action you can usefully do. So you still have the karuna, but you don't express it in action. And if you give in to an impulse just to meddle and try and do something that ends up making it worse, that's certainly not skillful. And if there is a skillful intervention you can make, then it's meritorious to do it. However, I still would argue that it's not mandatory under Buddhist ethics. Buddhist ethics requires that you refrain from doing ill, and there's merit to be gained by doing good, but by just abstaining from action is neutral. It's also possible to go too far in the other direction and to have some kind of a cold wisdom that there's no compassion behind it. And the Buddhist teachings have been, historically, they've been sometimes abused in that way. I think I've cited this before in other talks, the most stark example of this, some of the Japanese samurai who, informed by their practice of Zen, proclaim that when they chop a guy's head off, there's no karma made, no harm done. It's only emptiness, empty atoms passing through empty atoms. There's no self, there's no actual really a sword, there's no neck, it's all void, it's all illusory. So on some very abstract level that's true, but on a practical, mundane level of conventional reality, it's monstrous. To follow that, then not have the compassion for the other being. So compassion and wisdom have some tension between them until one is perfect in both. And you should always be striving to maintain that balance and act with compassion informed by wisdom. Now, the question that came up to inspire this discussion was about seeing one animal hurting another as in a predator-prey relationship. And I think the answer for that is that non-intervention is morally correct. But it's a more subtle question, I think, and more difficult to answer definitively. If you see a human being hurting another human being, should you intervene or become involved? And I don't think there's a simple answer to that. Certainly, if one can intervene and end the abuse non-violently, that's less problematic. That's certainly meritorious if you can do that without acting violently. But sometimes it might be the only way to save another person is to resort to some degree of violence. And then I think it's not a clear moral question. There are different kinds of karma. One classification of karma divides it into four. That there is dark karma with dark results, bright karma with bright results, mixed karma with both bright and dark results, and the karma that leads beyond karma, which is seeking enlightenment. And the dark and bright karma are obvious. If you do a harmful deed, you're going to have a bad result. If you do a bright deed of generosity or kindness, that's going to have a bright result. But there's a lot of actions in the world that are of this mixed type of karma. And this applies in so many instances. For example, if in a place in the tropics where there's malaria, if the health workers come in and spray pesticide into the swamp to kill the mosquito larvae, then they save many villagers from getting malaria, but they kill many thousands of mosquitoes in the process. That's not clearly one or the other. There's the bright result of helping the villagers, but the dark result of killing a mosquito larva. And we could probably think that the bright result outweighs the dark in this case, but they're still both present. I think one factor that mitigates the dark results when some mixed action is taken is if you focus on the bright side of it. So you're not focused on, in your mind, you're not focused on killing these damn mosquitoes. You're focused on saving the villagers. And this is what's foremost in the mind. Then this will maximize the bright results. In terms of interhuman violence, in the Vinaya for the monks, the only type of violent action that's countenanced, allowed, is in immediate self-defense, and then only to the degree is required to escape. So if you're attacked, you defend yourself. If that means knocking the guy down, then so far you haven't committed an offense. But if while he's down you kick him, then you're committing an offense. And there's no provision for acting violently on behalf of another in the Vinaya. So I think, if such actions are undertaken, they must be undertaken with the gravest reservation and understanding that there's a dark result as part of the package, inevitably. We see in the world that very often the idea of a violent intervention to help others becomes a cause of much greater suffering, is usually the excuse for every act of war. Countries go to war for so-called humanitarian reasons. You'll always see before a war, you'll see propaganda about how cruel and evil the other side is and what bad things they're doing, and we've got to put a stop to it. You know? So I think we have to be very, very cautious of that, and um, understand that there is no violent act against another person that is not free of karma, free of negative karma. This is quite different case with animals. I don't think that a lion taking down a wildebeest is creating bad karma. That's that their nature. It's the result of their previous karma that they were born into that state, and they don't really have it's not really an action with intention. But in the condition of human beings, we do have a greater degree of free will. We're not as constrained by our karmic baggage. The karmic baggage tends to be more in the way of impulses that we can succumb to or we can resist. And questions of right and wrong are always complex, and when you get down to cases, you can endlessly discuss and nitpick and to try and work out special details. But the general principle to remember is that which diminishes suffering for self and other is a positive, karmically positive, and that which increases suffering is karmically negative. And compassion is always, or karuna, is always to be developed as a spiritually positive mind state. But when it's put into action, it has to be modulated by wisdom.